All right, looks like it's just about time to get things underway. So, welcome on in, everyone, to our annual PSAT webinar. My name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director of IB Experience. So, I oversee our test prep and I do a lot of the test prep planning with our families. So, calls with families about when to take the test, what a test prep timeline should look like, questions about SAT versus ACT, etc. I'm joined by my colleague Evan Petrie. He's our
Hello.
assistant director of tutoring. So Evan schedules a lot of our tutoring. He helps me in training and managing and overseeing our team of tutors. And he also works with me quite closely on figuring out whether students should be taking the SAT or ACT, which is something that we're going to talk about, later on in the presentation. The first thing I like to start with in a conversation about the PSAT is really what is the value of the PSAT? One thing about it is that colleges will not see your score. So you don't have to worry about performing your very best on the PSAT from the standpoint of impressing a college necessarily. There's one specific reason to prepare for the PSAT, which we'll get to in a bit. But the main thing is that it's a practice test for the SAT, and it accomplishes many of the same things that taking a practice test on your own would. But the nice thing is that with the experience you're going to get with the actual testing platform and format, you'll also get to take it in that officially proctored environment. So it's one thing to take a practice test at the, nice comfy desk in your bedroom where you do all of your homework, but sometimes students can really benefit from taking the practice test in the testing environment with a proctor reading the instructions. It can kind of heighten the sense of importance. Students might take it a little more seriously if they otherwise wouldn't on a practice test. And on the flip side, it can tell us if a student might, need to worry about test anxiety, and that's something they'd have to prepare for when taking the real SAT, because the PSAT is going to mimic more of that kind of real, quote unquote, testing environment, even though it is a practice still. The main thing it does for you is provide a benchmark SAT score. So it shows you roughly what you'd expect to score on an SAT if you took that around the same time. I say roughly, more on that on a later slide. It's not an exact predictor, but it's a roughly accurate one. It is used to qualify for National Merit. The National Merit Scholarship is a scholarship that students apply for in the fall of senior year. Your junior year or 11th grade PSAT is what can qualify you to apply for that scholarship. More on that later. And again, just having experience with the digital format of this test is often helpful for students because you just get to, see the testing application, click around in it. If you're going to make any kinds of mistakes or anything like that, you make them on a practice test instead of on your real SAT. So those are the main reasons a student would, care about the PSAT. And these are important things, especially that benchmark SAT score, which we'll talk about a little later on tonight. With that, I'm going to kick things over to Evan to take us through what the actual technology of the digital test looks like.
Yeah, so going off that, as Jim said, it's a digital format to the test. There's more technology required here than just the plain old calculator, pen, and pencils that we may be used to from when we were taking SATs. The test is taken on a device that's brought from home. Usually, this is a school provided device, such as a Chromebook or laptop. It can be just a regular laptop taken from home. Tablets are also an option. We lean away from the use of tablets or iPads. It's nice to have the physical keyboard of a laptop. It's less fiddly. The screen size and screen orientation can also be an issue on tablets. Because you can't see the calculator in certain orientations of the screen as well, which is very important. Here is a screenshot from the PSAT. As you can see, there's only one question per page, and there's a few other things here which we'll get to in a little bit. The main thing, the main and most useful thing about the digital PSAT is Desmos. Desmos is this very powerful, very intuitive graphing calculator that is packaged as part of the PSAT and the SAT. It is built into the test. Students can also bring their own calculator, which we encourage for those simple 2 plus 2 equals 4, 4 times 4 equals 16 type calculations. But Desmos is going to be very useful for all sorts of graphing and solving all throughout the test. And here's an example of a question where Desmos can be used. You'll see up in the top right, there is a calculator button. You click that, and the calculator window on the left opens up. You'll see our question here is the y-intercept of the graph, y equals negative 6x minus 32 in the xy plane is 0, comma y. What is the value of y? So what we can do here, we can just type in that equation, y equals negative 6x minus 32. We can look for where the x value is 0, looking for 0, comma something. We see at 0, comma negative 32, that must mean y equals negative 32. So a very graphical, very intuitive way of solving equations that is a lot more streamlined than maybe just graphing it into your TI-84 and doing a lot of extra work from there. And the beauty of Desmos is that you don't have to type equations in this y equals format. Equations can be typed in all sorts of different formats as well as the simple y equals format. And yeah. Another piece of the technology of the test is that there is a built-in timer. No longer do you have to worry about getting the seat near the clock. The timer is built into the test, and you'll see we've highlighted it here on this page. Some students prefer to see it, some don't. We recommend not hiding it, though you do have that option. If it's your first time taking the test, that may be what you want to do. And it is also crash proof. The timer will pause if your computer crashes, and you can resume later. The caveat is that you must speak with your proctor if this happens to avoid the test not being submitted or not being scored for security reasons. Additionally, you've got annotation tools at your disposal, such as crossing out your answers. That's the big one here. And this is really cognitively important because it lets you stop focusing on answers that you've already discounted and only focus on the answers that you are interested in and as maybe the correct answer.
Awesome. By the way, everyone, I just want to shout out my video seems to be resisting cooperation right now. So I apologize if I can't find a way to return to camera, but I am still here.
That's all right. Additionally, we have more robust annotation tools such as highlighting, underlining. If you hit the annotate button up in the top right after selecting some text in the reading section, it'll pop up this window you've got here at the bottom. You can change the color of your highlight. You can change the style of your underlined dots, dashes, solid line. You can leave a little sticky note for yourself. If you leave the question and come back later, your notes will still be there. This is a great way to sort of organize your thinking and help you read passages more deeply.
All right, so let's talk about how this thing is scored. So the PSAT scoring is slightly different from the SATs. The PSAT is scored out of 1520 instead of 1600. So often I get the question from parents, well, does that mean that we could just add 80 points to our PSAT score and that tells us about our SAT score? The answer to that is a resounding no, and let me explain why. The PSAT is a slightly easier version of the SAT, right? The SAT is designed for juniors and early seniors. The PSAT is designed for early juniors and sophomores. And what that means is that the math level isn't going to get quite as high. The complexity of the reading passages isn't going to get quite to the heights that it can get to on the regular SAT. And so essentially, the questions where a student could prove that they deserve a score higher than a 1520 don't exist on the test. And so what that means is that the 80 points that are missing are only the top 80 points. So if you're scoring something around like, say, an 1100, 1200, 1300, you're not really being affected by the fact that the very hardest questions on the test are missing. Those are typically not going to have an impact on your score if that's the range you're scoring in. So it's not like you can just universally add 80 points. It's just that the PSAT says, hey, if you get every single question here right, all you've proven is that you could do at least a 1520 on the SAT. but you would need to actually take an SAT to show that you could score higher than that. Now, the National Merit Selection Index is an important thing to note, and I want to just back up and say that the National Merit Scholarship is a scholarship that is offered to apply for students who score in the top 1% of their state. So when we talk about National Merit Selection Index, unless you're, a student who does really, really well on standardized testing, this probably isn't relevant to you. But I do know from our list of attendees that we have a few of you in the chat here who are very concerned about this, so I'll make sure I explain it. So the National Merit Selection Index is scored out of 228. Essentially, you score it from a two-digit version of each subscore, so 76 for reading and writing and 76 for math. The thing is that your score for reading and writing actually gets doubled here. So basically, two times your reading and writing score plus your math score with 1 0 taken off would show you your National Merit Selection Index score. If you're curious, I can go through a breakdown in the Q&A by state of what score tends to qualify. It's relatively steady year to year. It can vary by 1 or 2 points, but typically states are pretty steady in terms of what would qualify on the PSAT for national merit. And that's something, like I said, we can cover in the Q&A if you're curious. But just know it is a little bit of a moving target, so I wouldn't be able to say today, what I expect for the current junior class, the national merit cutoff to be exactly. I could give you a range, what it was last year, but I can't like say what the cutoff is going to be. What it comes down to is since you're trying to score in the top, 1% of your state, really you just want to try not to get a single question wrong and limit those kind of careless errors as much as humanly possible. So, how does the qualifying work? As I mentioned, um, well, I haven't mentioned that there are two tiers of recognition that you can get just from your PSAT score. You can be commended by the National Merit Program, and that's if you score in the top 3-4% nationwide. It's going to be a total pool of about 34,000 students. These students are not eligible to apply for the National Merit Scholarship, but you just get a, hey, good job, you did really well on this test kind of thing. For National Merit semifinalist, that's when you're scoring in the top 1% of your state. It's going to be about half as many students, a little less. And this makes you eligible to apply for the National Merit Scholarship. So you don't get the National Merit Scholarship just from the PSAT score. You qualify to apply for it if you get the qualifying PSAT score. And again, that's using the qualifying index from the previous slide. Now, in terms of the score release timeline, so when are we going to get our results from the PSAT? Now, the vast majority of sophomores that take the PSAT will take it in October, and all of the juniors who take the PSAT will take it in October. And what that amounts to is that essentially the date of your test tells you the date you can expect to receive your score back. If your test happens before October 10th, you'll receive your score on October 23rd. November 6th will be the score release date if you test by October 24th, and then the rest of the students would receive it on November 13th. National Merit semifinalists, frustratingly, are not notified until the fall of senior year. So that's kind of an annoyance when you have your score and hypothetically everyone, who needs to make this decision has the scores ready too. But you don't get that notification until the fall of senior year. The format of the test is relatively straightforward. Each section of the test is consisting of two modules. So reading and writing has two modules, math has two modules. And the reading and writing, you'll have 27 questions in 32 minutes. Math, you'll have 22 questions with 35 minutes to work through them. You get a 10-minute break in the middle, and that's your chance to go to the bathroom and have a snack. More on the snack on a later slide. And your total runtime for this thing is going to be 2 hours, 14 minutes. That's for a student with the standard time limit. If you qualify for extended time, then that amount could be more. All right. Now, the SAT and PSAT are what are known as adaptive tests. And this is a bit of a kind of boogeyman in the standardized testing world. And what I mean by that is that people make much more of it than it actually is. So adaptive testing, The SAT and PSAT are both section adaptive. And that means that your performance in that first module, of which everyone receives the same difficulty, dictates the difficulty level of the second module of the test that you receive. In other words, if you do very well in that first module, then that means that you would receive a more difficult second module. If you do less well in the first module, you'll receive a less difficult second module. And of course, that higher difficulty module is going to give you access to a higher score in the end. So, the performance on the first module shrinks your kind of range of outcomes. To put it in a sort of visual, you can think of, everyone starts in the same module one. A lower module one score is going to spit you out into the easier module two, which we call module 2A, or the more difficult module two if you get a high score, which we call module 2B. And then that spits you out into the overall score curve of the test. There is some overlap. People often ask that. So if you do really well in the easier second module and someone else does really poorly in the harder second module, you can actually end up scoring higher than someone who got the harder second module. There is room for that kind of overlap. It's not super common. And of course, if you're trying to do as well as you can, you'd want to test into the harder second module either way. This is something that can frustrate students and cause some anxiety, and I've seen a lot of students, you know, kind of struggle with the concept of this test being adaptive. But I do just want to say, like, the way you get a higher score on a test is that you answer more questions right. And this is no different. The answer to, like, there's no special game to play with this system. People often ask, like, well, what if I get just enough questions wrong to go into the easier second module and then I absolutely crush it in the easier second module? Is that an easier path to the score that I want than having to fight my way through that harder second module? And the answer is no, because to make up for questions that you should have been able to get right in the first module that you got wrong on purpose, you now have to get harder questions right. So there's really no kind of gaming the system here. The answer is do your best on every question and then, just try to answer as many of those questions right.
Yeah, so another thing we get asked a lot about are the recent changes to the ACT. So the ACT has come out with what they're calling the enhanced ACT, and there's a few major changes that they've made. The ACT, first off, now has a digital option. Paper option is still available, and frankly, we prefer the paper option. Unlike the digital only SAT, where it's designed to be digital, it is formatted first as a digital test. The digital version of the ACT is just a digital version of the paper test. It is the paper test on a screen. So it is less optimized for a screen. The formatting and the layout is a little more cumbersome, and it's going to slow your student down. Time becomes a bigger factor here since digital is not its native format. Another big change to the ACT is that the science section has become optional. If you remember the ACT writing test, the essay, it used to be required as part of the ACT, and then they made it optional. And now no colleges require the ACT writing section. We'll see what happens with the ACT science section. The guidance from different colleges is differing. It is still required by some colleges and scholarships. In short, what we like to say is that the ACT doesn't really decide if the science section is optional. The schools and the programs you're looking at do. Additionally, the science is one of the fastest improving sections across both tests. It can be a missed opportunity, even if it's not specifically a strength. So we really recommend that all students continue to take the science section. Additionally, the one final change in the ACT is that the test has become a lot shorter. Not so much in terms of the length of the test. It is only about 5 or 10 minutes shorter than the legacy version of the test, if you're counting the science section. But the number of questions has been reduced by about 20%. So the amount of time per question has increased, making this the pacing here a lot more similar to a test like the SAT, where the questions are a little trickier, but you have a little bit more time per question. a major issue a lot of people have with the ACT is just how grueling that pace can be. It is a very, you have to go very fast through the questions to stay on pace. And now they've sort of slackened that pace a little bit and eased that issue a little bit for a lot of students. One more thing is that we have just received scores back for the first version, the first administration of this enhanced ACT, and everything is looking pretty good. So don't worry about your students adapting to this format if they were for some reason used to the previous format. Everything we're seeing so far is looking pretty good.
That's right. And ACT assured us in this transition that the content of the test would be about 90% the same. That seems to have really held up in terms of how our students improved on this test. It was honestly one of the best test dates in recent memory in terms of student improvements. Evan might have been underselling it there a little bit, but the changes are really in format and not content, I guess is the point
Yeah,
that I'm trying to make here. So
absolutely.
it's not like the SAT where a few years ago they redesigned the test and completely overhauled it. This ACT change is sort of a light edit to the test. Like one of the changes they made is that math has four answer choices now instead of five. Doesn't really change much about how you prepare for
Right.
the test, right? So it's very much similar to the way it's always been on the ACT. It's just a matter of, making sure students are ready for the changes here.
So you may ask, which test should I or my student take? I would tell you, take the test that is better for you. Well, how do I know which test is better for me? Take both and see which one you do better on. We recommend taking a diagnostic ACT to compare with your digital PSAT score around the same time that you take your PSAT. It doesn't need to be an official test score. There are diagnostics out there. ACT has a practice test on their website that can be used. If one test score is much stronger than the other, of course, focus on that one, play to your strengths. If you have a lead, you use it. If the scores are close, though, we can provide some advice on which way to proceed. As Jim said earlier, I take the lead on advising between recommending different tests. I will take a look. Our whole team will take a look at the various strengths and weaknesses presented on the results that we see and make a recommendation between the two tests.
And we offer free diagnostic testing for any student. So if your school offers the PSAT and you want to explore the ACT, we'll send a practice ACT with instructions to everyone who attends this webinar so that you can, try both tests and see which one fits for you. For sophomores, this can be helpful for making a plan for prep this summer. For juniors, it can be helpful for making a plan to test this spring. So if you haven't tried both tests, we really do recommend doing that up front. Now, in terms of when to take these tests, I'm going to kind of speak about this in two ways because we've got 10th graders on the call and we've got 11th graders on the call here. So, 11th graders, it's a little more straightforward. If you haven't started or, put together your test prep plan by the time PSAT scores come back, I like to recommend the March SAT date or the February or April ACT date as the test by which you should definitely have taken it once. So if you haven't yet taken an SAT or ACT officially and you're thinking the March test date, that can make a lot of sense. For a prep timeline, we usually look about 12 to 14 weeks out from your test date to get started. So you kind of count backwards from there. That means depending on your travel plans over the holidays and whether it's the, February, March, or April test, you're starting anywhere from kind of November to early January. You want to consider when you're in 10th grade, a few other things. So 10th graders, you consider first your math level. You want to have completed Algebra 2 and Geometry or the equivalent courses in your school's integrated math program if they use an integrated math program. Typically, it's integrated math 3 that is going to indicate the completion of these two courses, but it can vary a little bit. Schools use different numbering systems there. Email us if you're confused and we can look at your school's curriculum page and figure it out for you. The idea here is you want to have those two math courses or equivalents under your belt because they are the main math that's tested on the exam. So That's why juniors would wait till the end of junior year to test, take that, March or April test date as a first test if they're completing one of these courses as a junior. If you've already completed it by the end of 10th grade, you have the freedom to test whenever you want. Usually, the ideal timeline we'd recommend is prepping over the summer before your junior year because junior year is the most difficult year of high school. And so knocking out your test prep a little early is typically a good idea. You also want to consider your extracurricular and real life schedule. So you want to think about when you're the busiest. In other words, if you've been going to summer camp your whole life and it's a really important part of your life, right? Very fulfilling and rewarding to you. Well, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you throw that out the window to do test prep all summer. You just have to come up with a plan that's actually going to make sense. Make sure you can do it at a time of the school year where you can manage the workload of test prep. So you just have to think through these things yourself, right? If you're a student who's really busy in, say, a winter sports season, then taking the March SAT as your first test date might not make sense because most of that prep period would be during your busiest season of the year. And we say this all with mental health in mind because our philosophy here has been for a long time to quote unquote spread the stress. We don't want all of our stressors being acute and demanding all at the same time. We want to have, a lower level of worry over a longer period of time rather than cramming everything in all at once because that's when we start to see students lose their ability to sleep, lose their ability to keep up with their grades, lose the ability to, function as human beings if all these things are going wrong. And we want to make sure that we're keeping in mind that, doing well in these tests is important, but it's not the only thing in your life.
So when can I take the SAT or the ACT? In front of you, you'll see a list of the SAT and ACT dates for this summer, this fall, and the following spring and summer. Um, the last possible date that a senior should take the SAT or the ACT is going to be December, but that's only if they're applying regular admission. Early action, early decision. You really want to look for those September or October dates as being your final test dates that you're sitting for.
And typically the SAT, the October date will be taken by any school for their early deadlines. For the ACT, the October test date is not always accepted for the early deadlines. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Now, the question always comes in a presentation like this, isn't everyone test optional still? Or at least aren't the vast majority of schools test optional still? And the one word answer to that is yes. But in a test optional world, a strong score is still an admissions asset. One thing I'll say is if you're targeting highly selective schools, it's more important to have a score. That is for two reasons. One of those is that highly selective schools are more likely to require test scores, right? Like half of the Ivy League has gone back to requiring test scores, MIT, Georgetown, Stanford, etc. And the other thing is that when you're applying to those schools that are so highly selective, you want to have every factor in your favor that you can. And that often means that you need to make sure you have that test score as part of your application to support the rest of, what we hope is an excellent application. If you have a strong score, it's going to expand your options, both in terms of college choice and in terms of merit scholarships. Evan and I are both people who got full rides to our beloved state schools because of excellent standardized test scores. And that's,
Yep.
one of the reasons we do what we do because we are true believers in what these tests can accomplish for students. I know I'm still feeling the fact that I don't have student loans.
Yep.
And I mean that in a good way. So it's a very wonderful thing to do for yourself. The other thing I mentioned that is that if for you obtaining a strong standardized test score would just take up too much of your time, mental energy, and stress, then it is, there are plenty of options out there for test optional schools and plenty of great schools that are genuinely test optional. Any school, you're going to have a higher probability of admission if you send in the same application with a score that that school considers strong. At the same time, you have to weigh, the positives and negatives. And as I mentioned, even for a career test prep professional, standardized tests are not everything. And so this is a part of the conversation we have with families after they complete diagnostic testing with us. If the scores come in at a certain, level, and say we have a student who's getting straight A's in a really rigorous course load, has incredible extracurricular activities, we may say, like, look, keep putting your time towards that because the amount of time and effort it would take to get these test scores to a point where they support the rest of that application isn't worthwhile. Now, it's
Absolutely.
definitely the exception and not the rule. I can
Right.
probably count on one hand how many students, I recommend that to in a given year. But for some students, it's the right option and it's worth saying here.
We get a lot of questions as well about super scoring. What is super scoring? How do I use super scoring? Super scoring allows students essentially to combine section scores across test dates. So essentially, if you got on your March SAT, you got a 700 English, a 600 math, 1300 total. And then on your June SAT, you got a 600 English, 700 math, still a 1300 total. You could just submit the 700 English from your March SAT and the 700 math from your June SAT and get a 1400 for your super score. Most colleges accept super scoring. One notable exception is Georgetown, which requires you to submit all your separate test date scores and does not super score. But most colleges do allow super scoring, and this can be done for both the SAT and the ACT. As you can see, this would reward students who take the test more than once uh, and target their prep towards sections which they didn't do as well on the first time and don't have to worry as much about targeting those stronger sections that they already did well on. They can focus on the weaker sections and bring up that whole score. Preparing for test day, make sure to create your College Board account in advance. Schools should tell you how to do this. The quality and level of guidance on actually how to do that can vary. So we really recommend doing it in advance. Additionally, make sure you update the Blue Book app on your computer, the app which you'll be using to take the PSAT on the morning of the test. Make sure you bring your necessary equipment. So other than paper, pencils and 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 calculator, make sure to bring your charged testing device and make sure it is charged because the last thing you want is for your computer to run out of battery in the middle of the test. Make sure you bring layers of clothing. You don't know whether the testing room is going to be too hot, too cold. You want to have the ability to thermoregulate. Make sure you bring a snack and water. You don't want to get halfway through the test and be completely crashing out because you're thirsty or hungry. And bring a calculator as well. Again, for those simple 2 + 2 = 4 type hand calculations that are much easier to do on your hand calculator than in Desmos. Additionally, you will be provided one sheet of scratch paper. Make sure to remember that you can raise your hand and get more scratch paper whenever you need. Don't try to cram all of your work into every single last square inch of that scratch paper. You can raise your hand and the proctor must give you another sheet of scratch paper. You do have to ask for only one at a time. They will only give you one sheet at a time, but you are allowed to ask for as many sheets of scratch paper as you want. So ask early and often if you feel like you're going to run out.
I like to say sometimes that this digital SAT, one of the things that they're testing by moving the test onto a computer screen is it's sort of a discipline test for how many students or which students are actually going to write out the steps of their math problems to make sure they don't make a
Absolutely.
mistake. And this is especially true for national merit hopefuls when, the difference of one or two mistakes is going to be do or die to score in the top
Absolutely.
1% in your state. And so the best way to avoid mistakes is to write your steps down.
I'm always telling my students that.
Yeah,
Yep.
this is one of the main things we talk about in test prep, and it's super important to take that seriously. Okay, so how can we help students in terms of preparing for and this is whether it's the PSAT or the SAT. I'll skip to the second part first here. I mentioned that earlier that, the main reason to prepare for the PSAT is to qualify for national merit, and that's certainly true. The other main reason to prepare for the PSAT would be if you're a student who has high test anxiety. If you suffer from test anxiety, then, it can be the case that going into a test that you haven't prepared for at all is going to be a really difficult experience, right? And the score you get from going in blind to a test that's going to catch you completely off guard is not necessarily going to be very valuable if, you're struggling with anxiety the whole time. It's causing you to struggle with your time. You might be on the verge of a panic attack. If you think that, you're an anxious test taker and you're going to get much more valid data from your PSAT as a practice test by doing some prep so you're not going in blind, then that can make some sense too. Again, this isn't for colleges to see, it's just for you to actually get useful information about where you are now. In terms of how we work with students, so we adapt our sessions to the students' individual needs and goals. So we target our sessions based on students' assignments, meaning they're completing practice tests, targeted assignments in specific areas, and the tutor identifies where to focus based on what the student misses. Uh, our students are completing practice tests most week, or at least practice sections. And then parents, you're receiving an update after each session to, just go over what was covered in that session, and give you the opportunity to ask any questions. So if you're interested in learning more about working with us, I'll drop my Calendly link in the chat here, and you can book a time to speak with me. I'd be happy to talk to anyone if they're interested in test prep. But enough with that, and at this point, we'll jump into Q&A. So we've already got one question in the Q&A. Please keep them coming. Um, the first question surrounds SAT test dates, and it reads, sorry, I just X'd out of it by accident, so give me one moment to bring it back up. Okay, my son tried the SAT in August and has a low score. He wants to redo it. Is there a difference in the month of taking the SAT? Some people say that certain months are relatively easier than other months. Which month would you recommend? Great question. One of the more common questions we get on these webinars. There is a difference from one SAT to the next in how a student would improve or how a student would score. A student's score on any given day on the SAT is a range of outcomes, right? And it'll depend what side of the bed you woke up on, how well fed are you, it'll depend on just pure luck. Did the marching band practice outside your testing window? All those kinds of things will come into play. The thing is that easier and harder curves do exist on these tests, but they are not predictable. So we often get the question, well, is it better to avoid the fall test dates if I'm a junior? Because the seniors will be testing in the fall and they're a year ahead of me. So if I compete against them, then they're breaking the curve. And that means that my score is going to be lower. That's a misunderstanding of how the curves work on the SAT and ACT. The curves are predicted. And that means that they're based on a hypothetical population, which is mixed juniors and seniors, and they're not based on the student body that actually took that test on that day. Don't ask me how they do it that way. I'm not sure. They have PhD statisticians for that. I can teach you every statistical concept that shows up on the SAT and ACT, and not much more than that. So I would say, there is going to be a difference from one test to the next. If you score way lower on the official test than you did on practice tests, usually that just means you need to get back on the horse and try again on a different date. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to, target a specific month because there is no overall trend year to year. We look at this stuff as to which test dates tend to be the easiest. All right. It looks like those are all of our questions for the day. So please, if you have any other questions, reach out via our contact information on the screen here. You can call or text that number or email us at info@myivexperience.com. We're happy to answer any questions you have. Thanks for joining us and good luck to everyone on their PSAT. Take care, everybody, and thanks, Evan.
Thanks, everyone.